Chapter 9. She was still an unholy mess. It looked as though someone had dumped a couple of garbage cans inside the cabin, and the cushions were so wet they still squished when he moved on them. His back and side were soaked from sleeping on sopping foam. His left arm so wet it had wrinkles in it, as if he'd stayed in a bathtub too long. He stood with his head out on the top of the cabin hatch and stretched, noted that his arm could reach higher than it had the next day before, and looked to the sky, a flat blue that scarred down to the slate blue of the ocean, rolling still and slick and dead. Out at the horizon, it was impossible to see the line where the sea and the sky met, and he felt once more as if he were at the bottom of a large blue bowl. No wind? No, he thought. Make that still no wind. There was a worse than bad taste in his mouth, as if all night he'd been sucking on his feet, he thought. And he had no toothbrush. He turned automatically to the sink to get water to rinse his mouth out, but thought better of it. Fresh water was precious, much too important to spit out. Jamming up in the forward peak, where the water and wave action had taken place, was a plastic bucket. He retrieved it, found some thin line tangled in a ball, and untangled enough to cut and tie 10 feet to the handle of the bucket. He threw it over the side and pulled half a bucket of seawater back to the cockpit. He couldn't help standing well back from the side, remembering the shark, though he knew or felt sure it had been striking at the reflecting moonlight. He shuddered, remembering the teeth raking the side of the boat. In a small drawer near the floor, under the sink, the only drawer that hadn't flown open and scattered all its contents all over, he found a wash rag, topside again. He stripped down and carefully bathed his whole body. The cockpit was a small well with 2 drain holes at the back, not unlike a bathtub, and he washed and rinsed repeatedly, refilling the bucket several times by throwing it over the side and holding it above his head to dump it like a shower. It was the first time he had actually taken an inventory of himself, and he was amazed at the number of bruises. There were long, lateral, raking bruises down the sides of his ribs, black and blue lines that didn't hurt but looked as if they should. Then more splotches of blue on his hips and the inside of his legs. Those ached dully, and welt bruise across his stomach. He washed carefully, the salt water stinging gently when it hit a scratch or a small cut. There seemed to be many of them, as well as bruises. He rinsed the rag and dabbed at the cut on his head, while the broom had taken him. Where the broom had taken him, sorry. The storm must have been even more violent than he'd imagined. It must have hammered and thrown him around inside the cabin when he was unconscious. There could be no other explanation for all the bruises and cuts. Salt in wounds, salt water in wounds, was supposed to help heal them. Hurt, but heal. He'd read that somewhere. Oh, yes, now he knew. They used to whip men. He remembered the story suddenly. The British Navy used to tie men to the rail and flog them with a cat o' nine tails, a whip made of 9 leather strips, each with a small pellet of lead tied to its end. He'd read the story in one of the Owens sailing books. Just for drinking too much fresh water, a man could be flogged with a cat o' nine tails. Each time the whip struck, it would make cuts and lay the man's back bare, a vicious punishment from which men often died. But when they were whipped, some seamen, they had another man standing by the side with a bucket of salt water, which he would throw into the open wounds after each strike. Oh, David thought, squirming as the salt touched the small cuts and scratches on his sides and arms. It must have been unbelievable. The pain from the salt water must have hurt worse than the whip. He finished bathing. Then he took another bucketful and washed the cockpit out, and there was hunger. It came with that speed. His mind was thinking of a sailor hanging on a rail with his back in ribbons and another man throwing salt water on the wounds, and he dumped a bucket of water in the cockpit, and he was hungry. But now there was an awareness with it. This wasn't the hunger he'd felt before, which had to be filled right then, an emergency hunger. Now it was an ache, an emptiness that made him think as well as act. He found he could not separate his thoughts any longer. He was hungry, and that made him think of food, and then of how much food he had or didn't have, and that made him think again of where he was, how far from land he was, how far from help he was, and that made him think that there still was not a wind to drive him. Didn't look like a wind coming either. And that made him drink back to the hunger. So he wasn't just hungry. He was hungry with all his mind and body mixed in. Hungry with the whole mix of his life caught in it. Which means I can't just eat, he said aloud. All the other things have to be considered. I am hungry, he thought, but I am hungry while I am becalmed over 300 miles out to sea with no assistance available and one heck of a walk to McDonald's. I am hungry with a limited supply of food, and finally I am hungry but I cannot eat. There it is, he thought. There is the thought I was working for but could not think. I am hungry, and there is some food in the boat, some limited food, but I cannot eat. I must be very careful. The knowledge tore at him that there was food down in the boat, some cans of food, cans of chili, and fruit cocktail just lying around on the floor where they had been scattered by the storm. He couldn't eat them. Today was the first time in his life he had faced such a thing, and he knew also for the first time which it must be to be poor, truly poor, and have hunger and not be able to do anything about it. Once he had seen a man in dirty clothes, a street man dressed in the dirt of the streets, walking down the aisle in a supermarket in Oxnard, wearing an old field jacket. His eyes red and watering, his legs and feet shuffling along as he stared, just stared at the rows and rows of food that he could not have, could not buy, and could not eat. When he'd seen the man, David had been with his mother, and she had made some comment about a wino down on his luck. And David had agreed, but now he knew it for what it was, hunger. The man had wanted to eat, had been taken with hunger and the rows of food, but like David now, could not eat. It was then and was now a terrible thing. If David had been hungry and there was no food, he could have dealt with it more easily. But to be hungry and know that there was some food, no matter how little, made the knowledge almost a form of torture, a teasing torture. I could drink, he thought for a moment, and that would fill the emptiness and ease the hunger. But then he realized that he faced the same problem with water, fresh water. There was the tank water in the front end of the boat for fresh water, and he thought and he held 20 gallons, but he did not know how much water was in that tank. And as a matter of fact, even if it were full, 20 gallons of water was not very much when he was not just thirsty, but hungry and thirsty, and 300 miles out to sea with no wind and no help. Not just thirsty, but thirsty with all the rest of his life. And that thought made him the more thirsty, made his lips dry and his tongue stick to the roof of his mouth. All in seconds. He took his head and wiped his face with his hands. Small drops of seawater fell from the hair to the cockpit seat, and he ran his hands through his hair to get more of the water out. It was insane. Nothing had changed, really, but in just a few seconds he had gone from normal, healthy thinking to being ravenously hungry and thirsty, his tongue stuck to the roof of his mouth, his stomach caving in toward his backbone, all without reason. All, he thought, all in his mind. Again he shook his head. Well then, if he could think it, he could unthink it. If it was all in his mind, he could take it all out of his mind. And he did in only a few seconds, and the feeling passed. He was still hungry and thirsty, but it was controllable. And there was work to do. He pulled his shorts and jeans on, but left his t-shirt off and tied it around the handrail to air it out, although he put the life jacket back on. On second thought, he took his pants back off and tied them on the handrail as well. They were musty and stinky, and he felt fresh now, and it wasn't as if there were a lot of people around to see him romping around in his underwear and life jacket. He had to finish putting the frog back together, and he had to take some kind of inventory and figure out just what he had or didn't have.